Well, I'm just wondering about what you have said about this lack of strategy for the Muslim Brotherhood. So, do you think, through what you have said about this, I don't know if it is a conflict or not between the old guard and the young ones, how could the Muslim Brotherhood build up a strategy for how could they do this? So I'm just wondering about that.
Okay. How do you want to do this? Do you want me to just respond one by one? Okay, yeah. So again, I don't think the Brotherhood has really good options. I mean, I think what I would have liked to see, and I think what a lot of people, let's say, in the US or Washington would have liked to see, was the Brotherhood coming to terms with its mistakes and acknowledging some fault and being a little bit more honest and forthright about that. But to be honest, they might think, and perhaps rightly so, that if they started to kind of air out those internal debates and criticisms about, and self-criticism about how they governed over the past year, that could undermine the unity and morale of people on the ground. And that's actually, the Brotherhood is obsessed with organizational unity. And this would makes it very difficult for the Brotherhood to actually be creative or to try something that's fundamentally new, because that will always call into question whether the organization will go along with it. So it's a real challenge. So I would have liked to see them do that, but from an organizational standpoint, it could have caused problems internally. Like one of the initiatives that was being discussed in the coalition, and it was pretty much shot down in the end by the Brotherhood, was this idea that the opposition and the Brotherhood in particular would withdraw from direct political participation for a certain period of time as a gesture of goodwill in return for an easing of political restrictions and a minimal level of political freedom and a restart of the democratization process. And they said essentially, we're willing to stay out, we're out. For a variety of reasons, thank you, that was essentially, it was a very interesting idea, I think, but, and again, that would have been very controversial. I mean, imagine if the Brotherhood announced an initiative like that, a lot of people on the ground might say, wait, why are we making this preemptive concession? We're not the ones in the wrong. So I think anything the Brotherhood could potentially do would have a lot of risk. But you might say that that's what leaderships are supposed to do. They're supposed to think in a bold way. They're supposed to take risks. But I think the Brotherhood's leadership has always been conservative, not in the religious sense necessarily, but in the method of political change. They don't like rocking the boat. Status quo is better. Don't just, we'll go with what we're going with. And I'll just say one more thing on the issue of violence. I didn't want to get into this, but because it's a whole kind of issue on its own. But there is now a discussion about about violence. So Mahmoud Hussein released a statement in April endorsing a nonviolent approach, continuing peaceful resistance and all of that. So as an organization, the Brotherhood is not going to endorse violence anytime soon, but when you actually get into the discussions, it's difficult because essentially, what do you say about low-level violence that is oftentimes defensive in nature? So again, like I said, things like burning police cars, attacking security personnel, Molotov cocktails, that sort of thing. That's a difficult one to talk about because a lot of the people on the ground accept that or even endorse it. They feel that it's their right to defend themselves. And that's where you get into a tricky distinction between offensive violence and defensive violence. So I had like some really interesting conversations in Doha trying to figure out what counts as defensive and what counts as offensive. But it's a tricky one. And again, this is where you see a leadership-based tension, especially outside of the Brotherhood, because many of the activists on the ground in Egypt are not necessarily Brotherhood members. The ones who are not part of the Brotherhood are perhaps more inclined towards low-level violence because they haven't grown up in the Brotherhood's organizational structure where you're immersed in the ideas of nonviolence and gradualism and sabr and whatever else it might be. So there is, that's going to be a real challenge going forward, is how do they come up with a position on violence that is acceptable to the international community, but is also realistic in the sense that many supporters on the ground are okay with a certain kind of violence. And they might say, so one of the examples that was given to me was, let's say, you know, your sister was sexually assaulted by a police officer. If you see that police officer walking around, you have the right to do something to him. And that was an example of defensive or retaliatory violence. So that's going to be another tricky debate, I think. It's already a tricky debate.
Osman? Hamid?
Just a question about the violence issue that's just approached here, because I think we have noticed a lot from the younger generation, from the Muslim Brotherhood, where they endorse that, whether or not it comes from above or from its own. Don't you think that the Muslim Brotherhood leadership, at some extent or somehow, they lost control over the younger generation? And I've seen it so many times where they said, hey, we don't control the street anymore. Whatever happened in the street, we cannot fuel it up or cool it down. We cannot. So don't you think that this is like, it's going out of control?
Yeah.
And whatever can happen in the street, it will happen
Yeah.
no matter what?
I think this is particularly the case for non-Brotherhood members who are still Brotherhood supporters, because for them there's no bay'ah. They have no allegiance, any kind of formal allegiance to the Brotherhood leadership. So even if Mahmoud Hussein comes out and says something, they're not bound to that. So I think there's an important distinction between Brotherhood members and Brotherhood supporters. But even with Brotherhood members, the fact is that the normal organizational structures have been undermined. You don't have the same kind of hierarchy. Now, they still are operating, especially outside the urban areas, and some of them are still trying to have their usras on a weekly. I mean, it's very challenging. So the whole way the organization behaves and does business with its own members is changing, right? But I do think that there still is, they have a system of rotating leaders, so if someone gets arrested, someone will take his place, and they're able to go down 3rd tier, 4th tier, 5th tier, so they're able to adapt. So there is, I think, still some control that they can exert over Brotherhood members, but again, if Brotherhood members are only 30 to 40% of a particular protest, then what do you do about the other 60%? You can try to convince them, and that's, I think, what a lot of people, what the argument is, that we do our best to tell people not to use violence.